Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. I'm so excited to talk today about the future of language with my dear friend, Casper Grathwohl. Casper, thanks so much for joining us on Future of XYZ.
Oh, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Lisa.
Well, I mean, I couldn't not invite you to talk about this important subject. I mean, you are, after all, the president of Oxford University Press Languages. So I don't actually know what that means, but I know I have a passion for language, and I wanted to talk about the future of language, and you seem to have an apropos expertise, having spent more than 25 years at Oxford University Press.
Yes, so Oxford Languages is the division of Oxford University Press. We used to be where we publish dictionaries, and it's so interesting. For years now, I introduce myself at a cocktail party or something, and then I say, "Oh, I'm a dictionary publisher," and I would get that look. People would give me that look of like, "Oh, like you were on hospice care or something." Like, dictionaries are just. But what's so interesting is, although we don't pick up books off the shelf anymore and look up a word in a dictionary, we use the use case for dictionaries is just as strong as it's ever been. And about 20 years ago or so, we started working with technology companies in their infancy to provide some of the language and dictionary type of information that's needed underneath the applications and the software that they develop. So whether it's a scroll over and you look up a word, or you can click on something and look up, that's where it started with us. And then they started coming to us with more sophisticated language technology needs and natural language processing needs. And we've pivoted over the last 20 years to become a language service and data business that blossomed out of a dictionary publisher. We still publish the OED and things like this, but we now work with a lot of big tech and other companies to really address a lot of the digital language challenges that we're facing in the world today.
Well, it's totally fascinating because I give this talk, or especially pre-COVID, I used to give this talk on like calculated risk taking, and it was all about like surfing the wave and being ready for anything and agility. And it seems very irrelevant now because it's so obvious, but it was really quite novel before COVID hit. But one of the things that I go through to set up the premise is like, what are the major, let's call them disruptions of human history that have fundamentally shifted the course of humankind thereafter? And one of the major ones, of course, is the printing press, right? It was how information went from a verbal, hand-me-down narrative to something that could be held and created, obviously beyond papyrus and stone tablets and things like this. So mass media in its first thing. I mean, that obviously is where you guys kind of started. I mean, Oxford University Press, as part of University of Oxford, has been around for whatever 400 or 500 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But like, what's coming? I mean, you guys obviously pivoted 20 years ago. You're working with these big tech companies. Like, what is that next disruption in language, if you will? Or is it already in front of us?
I mean, it's a good question. We've got the immediate next steps, which is really about kind of universal understanding of language, a universal language, or translation of this, so that everyone really understands each other in a way that we don't have those barriers anymore. But when you think about a real disruptor that's a paradigm shift, I don't know. I mean, in talking with a lot of tech folks and the like around language issues, I mean, maybe it has to do, Elon Musk and others talk about that, they want the chip in their brain. When it comes down to it, the computers that we have as a brain are much more sophisticated and subtle than our AI counterparts, but they lack the firepower. Like, we just can't work as fast as what we've been able to create. And so this blending of our own kind of processes with some mechanical AI is something that I worry that actually there's more happening in laboratories around than we actually know, and we're farther along in that process than we think. I mean, I have no insider information, but I do feel like I can start to see in how we think about natural language processing, I can see the point at which it's, if not inevitable, it's likely that we would move beyond language as we understand it now. I know that's really conceptual, but I think that, these things come, we seems like we wait and wait and wait for decades for them. And then when they happen, it's like a whoosh, and then it's here, the iPhone came and just changed everything, but we kind of been waiting for a long time. And, I think that with language, that's going to happen as well. And it's going to be a computational paradigm shift.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think about, we already know that there are these implants or sensors that can now, people who are paralyzed, for instance, and actually don't have motor speech anymore, they can actually now communicate. So this is in its own way, as you say, plus the laboratory, plus like those big tech companies doing whatever they're doing behind closed doors. It is interesting to imagine what's happening, but there is a lot happening in the realm of technology meeting language. And I want to come back to the basics of language in a bit, but like technology meets language. I mean, you just talked about natural language processing. You talked about AI. I mean, there is, I think the first painting that was ever created or poem that was written by AI just, got published, and people are kind of a little bit up in arms. We don't know how we feel about this. Like, what's the role of technology properly in language right now?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, it's facilitating communication in a way that there's definitely a plus there. I think that the minus that we're worried about is, what does it mean when you can't tell if someone is a human or not that you're communicating with, or establishing a relationship with? What does a relationship mean if it can be simulated in a way that is almost undetectable? And so, I think what's interesting about language engineering right now is, we have gotten to a point where AI's comprehension of, these neural engines are able to understand, learn, understand, and then be able to regurgitate, I guess, in certain way, at a way that is, that Turing test, the one where, you kind of, do you're talking to, or you're interacting with a robot, is getting harder and harder, but there are still challenges here where AI falls short. And, some of it is, when you think about how multilingual we are as a society, and, as a global society, America tends to be pretty monolingual, but, you go to parts of India where, everyone speaks 2, 3, 4 languages, but they're not necessarily kind of strict in, I'm speaking this language formally, and then I'm moving to this language. They code switch all the time. They're mixing words, and English as a dominant cultural language around the world, it's amazing how you go and you hear languages just being kind of woven into each other. And that's something that can be very difficult for, that's the subtle part that's hard for computers to really understand. And I'm not saying they won't be able to, or that they're not getting good at it, but we're giving them more and more sophisticated kind of benchmarks to meet in order for certain use cases. And they are getting better, but they are still not there. The need for humans in the loop is what you call it, where, humans are helping kind of edit and modulate the kind of learning they need. Yes, and educate. I mean, humans are teaching these computers through big data sets and what we call corpora of language that these neural engines and these machine engines, they learn on these, and they're getting smarter and smarter. And there may come a time where humans in the loop isn't necessary, that they can extrapolate in a way that they move beyond kind of us as teachers.
Which is fascinating. I want to come to this point that you made, though, that English is a dominant language. I mean, that has been, like, let's just say over the last 30 years, especially, this has shifted. English became the de facto language of business around the world, of capitalism, frankly spoken, right? It is now spoken by, the next most popular language is Mandarin Chinese, but English is spoken by 230 million more people. Right? I mean, it is infiltrated everything, to your point. And I, as a French speaker, I think about like the Académie Française, which tries always to kind of control the French language. But you have le weekend, you have all sorts of le burger, all sorts of things that have become Englishisms or Anglicisms.
Yeah, they're loan words. Sure, sure.
Exactly. And this is happening in all sorts of languages, right? Where the English is infiltrating, and you just mentioned it in terms of challenging the AI. I really love this because I think that it's always been two parts, right? Like if you think about words like courgette, or aubergine, which the Brits
Sure.
use, that are direct French references to zucchini or eggplant in this case, right?
Yeah.
So it's always been going back and forth between dominant languages and influence. What's kind of like, what do you see as like, is English always going to be dominant? Like, where are we going in terms of language as Oxford University Press, English dictionary publisher?
Sure, sure. I mean, what's interesting is both ends of the spectrum are mutating really quickly, and in some ways they balance each other out. The rise of English as a global language, as you said, it's been amazing, the way in which English has become this kind of lingua franca that, as you say, sort of business and capitalism might have driven that, and culture, cultural capital, but
Pop culture,
ultimately, there are, I think, something like 2 billion people in the world might speak English, but only 400 million or half a billion actually are native speakers. Like most of the speakers, there's far more people who have learned English as a second language than speak it natively. So, but ultimately, English itself is changing. It has really become, as it's become a global language, the ways in which it has started to interact with other local languages in areas where you speak it is really fascinating. You look at something like Nigerian English and the words that are moving into global English as a result of, Nigerians speaking English and mixing it with other, local languages is really fascinating. And that's happening everywhere in the world. And I think that's a really interesting phenomena to watch, and we track, in a way that we're looking at global English all the time and trying to understand how words are coming into the language and what the origins are, how they've been developing, or whether it's a loan word or whether it's a new word that has an influence from another language, and the like. At the other end of the spectrum, from English, you have translation tools that are becoming more and more sophisticated. And I think that's really interesting because you're also simultaneously, you're having more and more people speak a lingua franca, but also it's becoming easier and easier to be able to speak your local language and communicate with someone who speaks their local language, and neither of you have a language in common.
Right.
And, again, it's going to take some time. If you have a pen pal, do you want to? Sure, you can go through a universal translator, and it might be a little clunky at times, but it could, can work. Do you want medical information to be passed through that? That's life and death in a surgery room? Absolutely not. So,
right.
But it's getting better and better. And what I think is really interesting is, all languages, though, are not equal, and they never have been. But in the digital space, we talk about a digital divide, that's class, economic, all kinds of socioeconomic factors in there.
Of access, really.
Absolutely, of access. But language is no different, and language actually is language technology is a real piece of that. So you have only 12, maybe 14 languages that are really global languages that are fully integrated into our digital lives. As we iterate versions of technology and new softwares coming on the market and new applications, it's available in those languages. But once you hit like 12 or 14 of those major world languages, some of the major European ones, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, English, it starts to fall off a cliff. And part of it is because there hasn't been development, and there's not digital text as a building blocks to learn in some languages, because they haven't been economically powerful enough languages in the digital space to drive need and demand. And so you have this situation where you've got you've got over 100 million speakers of a language like Bengali, and really, I think Bengali has like 300 or 400 million speakers, and yet you speak Bangla. You live in a part of the world where you speak Bangla. If in your neighborhood, if you're talking to someone, you talk to them in your own local language. The minute the two of you go home and communicate online in some way through social media or through your services or your Facebooks or your WhatsApps, chances are you're communicating in a language that is second to both of you, because you don't have all of your applications
The
aren't
tools.
localized into Bangla. Well, that's
Interesting.
happened. And that's a challenge, because the subtlety and the richness of your communication in your own native language is something that, it's hard to put a finger on the value of that, but you recognize how well you are able to communicate in a language that you have, that is a primary native, that you're a native speaker of. So one of the things we're trying to do, and there's a lot of more focus now on what we call these under-resourced languages, languages that have millions of speakers, but the digital ability to be able to live a digital life in that language is limited. And we're spending a lot of time on that now. The big tech companies are really now focused a lot on Indian languages, and partly because India, as a
I think
digital
there's
economy,
something like 4,000 dialects spoken in India or something crazy.
well, and there's 24, 26 official national languages of India, and so but part of it is because
400 languages, not 4,000, because there are I think there's 7,117 languages in the world that are recognized as spoken today.
Yes, exactly. That sounds right. And so, India is an example where all of a sudden now, as big tech and other technology wants to really localize more and more to grab digital dollars, first in these in parts of the world that are becoming more digitally savvy, they've now taken a real interest in Indian languages and really trying to localize and provide the building blocks. They're the ones who will provide the APIs and the all of the kind of tools that developers can then use to develop all the
open
things
source
to do with
tools
those
for
local
language.
languages. Yeah. But, and what's interesting is African languages, which are really rich and diverse, are probably half a decade to a decade behind, where the interest in India is. Again,
but they're also largely spoken languages as well, right? I mean, historically,
well,
we
no,
have a lot of languages in the world have still
yes,
to this day carried forward with an oral history more than a written history.
Yes, and some have, but but what I think is really challenging is when you've got a language that is very vibrant and living. It's got millions of speakers, but it doesn't have a digital level of sophistication, and it's been in some ways penalized because the economic power of those speakers has not caught the attention of the digital sphere, but it is now, and so and there are a lot of groups that are really trying to accelerate that so that we create more of those digital building blocks and work with local communities for them to do it themselves, because this isn't a colonial exercise, and so that people have the ability to live full, rich digital lives in their native language. It feels like that should be one of those universal rights that we're trying to really develop for people.
Well, I think it's super powerful because for that you said two things that tie to that for me. One is there is nothing like the nuance of communicating in the same language with the same level of command over that language, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you speak another language, that moment when you learn to communicate and express yourself, whether that's getting angry or saying something, sensual or whatever it is, there's a moment or a business presentation where you're like, oh, I got that, right? And you're right that like the computer right now it misses some of that nuance, but it's really rich that there are, as I did the research for this call, there are 7,117 languages today, but 90% of those apparently are spoken by 100,000 people or less. So to your point, some of these are the most marginalized of people and populations who don't have access. So the fact that we can empower them with tools and not as a colonial invasion of like, well, this is how you're going to do it, but allowing the digital life to come to the fore seems very relevant. I'm curious.
It's worth noting, though, a lot of those people who speak those languages also speak a language that, it might be that, it's a Native American language and they speak English, but they also are trying to keep a tribal language alive or something. There's a lot of languages like that, or that have, all that have relevance, and we're trying to preserve. I think that's a slightly different, language preservation of that sort in the digital age is something where we do have the tools and ability now to be able to archive and codify that, as because one of the biggest challenges with endangered languages is that when they become extinct, there is no one who is able to then record, and so we lose that language forever. We've got a window now with digital tools that allow it to be much easier to capture those before they go. What I'm more interested in myself is where there are large numbers of speakers of a language that includes a whole either society or culture, and it feels like there is a linguistic disadvantage that they have because there's not the level of richness to be able to communicate in that language as there are in some of the major world languages. And that's something I think we have a responsibility to address, and we've got the ability to do it. And I'd like to make sure that we do it not just based on, well, what's the cost benefit ratio of timing, because that's when we can get something out of a certain community. So now we're going to start focusing on allowing them to communicate in their own language. That feels like a really bad scenario to be in.
So I'm looking at time where this is a conversation as someone who's always said that her number one genie wish would be to speak every language. And I would include computer code of every kind in that these days, but I really would, that would be like for all the reasons that we've named. So I'm going to put the last question to you, Casper, as a personal one. What is your favorite language, and or what is your favorite word in the English dictionary?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So those are both really difficult questions. The favorite language, I don't really have a favorite language, but I did study hieroglyphics for a couple of years because I was interested in learning Coptic, and Coptic is hieroglyphic grammar, like in a modified Greek alphabet. And so I had to study hieroglyphics for a few years, and I have to say, just there's a beauty in that language and the grammatical structure of that language that I have a soft spot for. So that's a little nerdy, probably way nerdier
I'm like,
should have
oh
let
my God,
on.
I just learned something totally new about you. I'm so excited.
In terms of my favorite word in English, it changes all the time. I'm one of those people who, like, my love of language manifests in that my favorite word is the word that you've put in front of me most recently that just excites me. So my favorite word changes almost every day, but I do love, and just as a shameless plug, there's an OED word of the day that people can subscribe to.
Oxford English Dictionary.
The Oxford English Dictionary, and it's interesting because it's rare and strange words sometimes, but what I like about it is it really goes into, if you want to dig deep, it provides the origin of that word and the early antedatings of when it was first used and came into the language. And
this is the etymology of the word.
The etymology of the words are there, and so it's really interesting. So I encourage people, if you are a wordsmith or a bibliophile, subscribe to the word of the day at the Oxford English Dictionary.
I love that. Casper, thank you so much for joining us on Future of XYZ to talk about the future of language. My God, there's lots there.
Oh, it was really fun, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
And everyone watching or listening, if you don't already subscribe to Future of XYZ, make sure you do so. You can do it at YouTube or anywhere you get your favorite podcast. You can follow Future of XYZ on Instagram, and we are booking guests for 2023, which seems crazy, but make sure you visit future-of.xyz to nominate yourself or someone you know, or just let us know what topics you want to hear about next year. Thanks again, Casper. We'll talk more about hieroglyphics soon.